When I left for deployment, I thought I was leaving behind a life built on trust and love. My wife, Sarah, was my rock. She was the one who held me together during the toughest times, the one who promised to wait for me no matter how long I was gone. I believed her. I had to. Deployment is hard enough without doubting the person you love most. The day I left, she stood at the airport with tears in her eyes, clutching my hand like she never wanted to let go. "I'll be here when you get back," she said, her voice trembling, "no matter what." Those words became my anchor, the thing I held on to during long nights in the desert, under a sky that felt too big and too empty. I'd replay them in my head, over and over, like a mantra. "She'll be here, she'll be here." At first, everything seemed fine. We talked every chance we got, early mornings before my duties started, late nights when I could steal a moment alone. She'd tell me about her day, about work, about the little things that made her laugh. I'd tell her about the guys in my unit, the jokes we shared to keep our spirits up, the letters I was writing to her. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It had to be. But as the months dragged on, something shifted. Her calls became shorter, her texts less frequent. She always had an excuse: work was busy, she was tired, or she just needed some space. I tried to push the nagging feeling aside, but it lingered like a shadow. I told myself I was being paranoid, that distance was playing tricks on my mind. After all, deployment is hard on both sides. Maybe she was just struggling in her own way. Still, the doubts crept in. I'd call her, and she'd answer with a tone that felt distant, like her mind was somewhere else. "I'm just stressed," she'd say when I asked if everything was okay. "Work's been crazy." I wanted to believe her, but the excuses started to pile up. She missed our scheduled calls more often, and when we did talk, the conversations felt forced, like we were strangers trying to make small talk. I started noticing little things that might not have meant anything on their own but felt significant when I put them together. Like the way she'd suddenly start talking about her boss, Johnson, like he was some kind of hero. "He's been so supportive," she'd say. "I don't know what I'd do without him." At first, I brushed it off. Of course, she'd talk about her boss. He was a big part of her daily life. But then the stories became more frequent, more detailed. She'd mention how he'd taken her out to lunch, how he'd stayed late to help her with a project, how he'd been there for her when she was feeling overwhelmed. I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was just letting the stress of deployment get to me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder the doubts became. I started wondering if there was more to her relationship with Johnson than she was letting on. Was he just a supportive boss, or was there something else going on? The thought ate at me, but I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding accusatory. How do you ask the person you love if they're cheating on you when you're thousands of miles away? I didn't want to believe it was possible. Sarah wasn't that kind of person. At least, I didn't think she was. But then there were the nights when I'd call, and she wouldn't answer. I was asleep, she'd say the next day. Or I had my phone on silent. It didn't make sense. She'd always been so eager to talk to me before. Why was she suddenly so hard to reach? I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on my duties and the mission at hand. But the doubts followed me everywhere, like a ghost I couldn't shake. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my bunk, wondering what was really going on back home. Was Sarah still the woman I married, or had she changed while I was gone? The deployment felt like it would never end. Every day was a battle not just against the enemy, but against my own mind. I'd tell myself I was being ridiculous, that Sarah loved me and would never betray me. But then I'd remember the distance in her voice, the excuses, the way she talked about Johnson, and the doubts would come rushing back. By the time my deployment was finally over, I was a mess. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and I didn't know what to expect when I got home. Part of me wanted to believe everything would be okay, that we'd pick up where we left off and rebuild what we'd lost. But another part of me was bracing for the worst, preparing myself for the possibility that the life I'd left behind was gone forever. Little did I know, the real battle was just beginning. Coming home was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I had imagined it 1,000 times during those long, grueling months away, running into Sarah's arms, holding her tight and never letting go. I pictured her smile, the way her eyes would light up when she saw me, the way she'd say my name like it was the most beautiful word in the world. But when I finally walked through the door, something fell off. The house was different. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things that didn't add up. A pair of shoes by the door that weren't mine, a coffee mug on the counter that I didn't recognize, a faint scent of cologne lingering in the air. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me after being away for so long. But the unease stayed with me, like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. Sarah was there, of course, waiting for me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She hugged me, but it felt stiff, like she was going through the motions rather than truly feeling it. "Welcome home," she said, her voice soft, but lacking the warmth I remembered. I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong, to convince myself that this was just the awkwardness of reuniting after so much time apart. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Over the next few days, I noticed more little things that didn't sit right with me. Sarah seemed distracted, like her mind was always somewhere else. She'd zone out during conversations, only half listening to what I was saying. When I asked her about work or how she'd been spending her time, her answers were vague, almost rehearsed. "It's been busy," she'd say, or same old, same old. There was no detail, no enthusiasm, just a wall of words that kept me at arm's length. Then there were the phone calls. She'd take them in another room, her voice hushed, and when I'd walk in, she'd quickly hang up. "Work stuff," she'd say, but the way she avoided my eyes made my stomach twist. I wanted to believe her, to trust that she was telling the truth, but the doubts were growing louder, harder to ignore. One night, I woke up to find her side of the bed empty. I got up to look for her and found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with her phone in her hands. She was typing something, her face lit by the glow of the screen, and she didn't notice me standing there. I watched her for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before I finally spoke. "What are you doing up?" She jumped, startled, and quickly locked her phone. "Just couldn't sleep," she said, her voice too casual, too light. She stood up and brushed past me, heading back to bed without another word. I stood there in the dark, staring at the spot where she'd been sitting, and for the first time, I let myself consider the possibility that she was hiding something from me. The next morning, I tried to push the thoughts away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my insecurities get the best of me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the evidence piled up. She'd leave her phone face down on the table, something she'd never done before. She'd disappear into the bathroom for long stretches, claiming she was taking a shower, but I'd hear the faint sound of her voice through the door. And then there was the way she'd flinch when I touched her, like my hands were a stranger's. It was the flinching that hurt the most. I'd reach for her hand or try to pull her into a hug, and she'd tense up, pulling away like she didn't want me near her. It was a small thing, but it cut deeper than anything else. This was the woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved with all my heart, and now she couldn't even stand to be touched by me. I tried to talk to her about it, to ask her if something was wrong, but she always had an excuse. "I'm just tired," she'd say, or "I'm still adjusting to having you back." I wanted to believe her, to give her the benefit of the doubt, but the distance between us was growing wider every day. It was like there was a wall between us, one I couldn't see but could feel with every word, every glance, every touch. By the end of the week, I was a mess. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about all the little things that didn't add up. I felt like I was losing my mind, like the life I'd come back to wasn't the one I'd left behind. And then, one night, I found the text. Sarah had left her phone on the kitchen counter, and when it buzzed, I glanced at the screen. The name, Johnson, flashed, followed by a message that made my stomach drop. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't stop myself from scrolling through their messages. The truth was there, in black and white dates, times, plans they'd made while I was gone. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My wife, the woman I'd trusted with my life, had been sleeping with her boss, And it wasn't just a fling, it was a full-blown affair. I sat there, numb, as the pieces fell into place. The late nights at work, the sudden interest in self-care, the way she'd been distant even before I left. It all made sense now. But knowing the truth didn't make it hurt any less. If anything, it made it worse. I had spent months clinging to the hope that Sarah was waiting for me, that our love was strong enough to survive anything. But now I knew the truth, and it shattered everything I thought I knew about her, about us, about the life we'd built together. I didn't confront her right away. I needed proof, something undeniable. So, I waited. I watched. And when the time was right, I set up a camera in our bedroom. It didn't take long for the truth to reveal itself. The footage was clear, undeniable. Sarah and Johnson, in our bed, in our home, while I was thousands of miles away fighting for a country that felt like it had betrayed me too. When Sarah came to me with the pregnancy test, tears of joy streaming down her face, I felt nothing but cold rage. She thought this was a new beginning, but for me, it was the end. I handed her the suitcase, the divorce papers, and the videotape. Her joy turned to shock, then horror, as she realized what I knew. Watching her leave was both painful and cathartic. She begged, she cried, she tried to explain, but there was nothing she could say that would change what she'd done. The betrayal cut too deep. I couldn't look at her without seeing the lies, the deceit, the way she'd shattered everything we'd built. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief. I knew I'd never fully trust again, but I also knew I'd survived. The deployment, the betrayal, the heartbreak I'd made it through. And as I stood there, alone in the house that no longer felt like home, I realized something important. Sometimes, walking away is the bravest thing you can do. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the lies, free from the pain, free to start over. And that, in its own way, was a kind of victory. The day I found the text on Sarah's phone was the day my world came crashing down. It wasn't even intentional. I wasn't snooping, wasn't looking for trouble. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter, and when it buzzed, I glanced at the screen out of habit. The name Johnson flashed, followed by a message that made my stomach drop. "Can't wait to see you tonight." I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to put the phone down, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. The words burned into my mind, and I couldn't stop myself from scrolling through their messages. What I found was a trail of lies, a series of conversations that left no room for doubt. Sarah and Johnson weren't just co-workers, they were having an affair. The messages were detailed, filled with plans and promises that made me sick to my stomach. They'd been meeting up for months, sneaking around behind my back while I was thousands of miles away, fighting for a country that felt like it had betrayed me too. I read through their conversations, my hands shaking, my vision blurring with tears. There were dates, times, places, all of it spelled out in black and white. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My wife, the woman I'd trusted with my life, had been lying to me for months. She'd been sharing a bed with another man, sharing secrets and intimacy that were supposed to be mine. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever experienced, deeper than any wound I'd sustained in combat. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to scream and shout and demand answers. But another part of me held back. I needed proof, something undeniable, something she couldn't talk her way out of. So, I decided to wait. I'd let her think everything was fine, let her believe I had no idea what was going on. And while she thought she was pulling the wool over my eyes, I'd gather the evidence I needed to expose her lies. Over the next few days, I watched her like a hawk. I noticed things I hadn't before: the way she'd check her phone constantly, the way she'd disappear into another room to take calls, the way she'd flinch when I touched her. It was like living with a stranger, someone I thought I knew but who had turned out to be someone else entirely. I started keeping track of her movements, noting when she left the house and when she came back. I'd follow her from a distance, watching as she met up with Johnson at coffee shops, at parks, at hotels. It was like a knife twisting in my gut every time I saw them together, but I couldn't look away. I needed to see it, needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. One night, I decided to take it a step further. I set up a camera in our bedroom, hidden where she wouldn't notice it. I didn't want to do it, didn't want to invade her privacy like that, but I felt like I had no choice. I needed proof, something concrete that she couldn't deny. It didn't take long for the camera to capture what I was looking for. One evening, Sarah told me she had to work late. I nodded, pretending to believe her, and watched as she left the house, dressed in a way that felt too deliberate, too calculated. I waited until she was gone, then checked the camera feed. What I saw shattered whatever was left of my heart. Sarah and Johnson, in our bed, in our home, while I was sitting in the next room, oblivious to what was happening. The footage was clear, undeniable. There was no way she could talk her way out of this. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling numb. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And she'd done it in our home, in the place that was supposed to be our sanctuary. It was like she'd taken everything we'd built together and set it on fire, leaving nothing but ashes in its place. When Sarah came home that night, she was all smiles, acting like nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek, asked me how my day was, and started talking about some project at work. I listened, nodding along, but inside I was seething. How could she sit there and lie to my face, pretending everything was fine, when she'd just been with another man? I didn't say anything that night. I couldn't. I needed time to process what I'd seen, to figure out what I was going to do next. But as I lay in bed beside her, listening to her breathe, I knew one thing for certain: our marriage was over. There was no coming back from this, no way to repair the damage she'd done. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. I'd confront her, but not in the way she expected. I'd let her think everything was fine, let her believe I had no idea what was going on. And then, when she least expected it, I'd drop the bomb. When Sarah came to me with the pregnancy test, tears of joy streaming down her face, I felt nothing but cold rage. She thought this was a new beginning, but for me, it was the end. I handed her the suitcase, the divorce papers, and the videotape. Her joy turned to shock, then horror, as she realized what I knew. Watching her leave was both painful and cathartic. She begged, she cried, she tried to explain, but there was nothing she could say that would change what she'd done. The betrayal cut too deep. I couldn't look at her without seeing the lies, the deceit, the way she'd shattered everything we'd built. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief. I knew I'd never fully trust again, but I also knew I'd survived. The deployment, the betrayal, the heartbreak, I'd made it through. And as I stood there, alone in the house that no longer felt like home, I realized something important. Sometimes, walking away is the bravest thing you can do. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the lies, free from the pain, free to start over. And that, in its own way, was a kind of victory. The day I confronted Sarah was a day I'll never forget. It wasn't just about the confrontation itself. It was about everything leading up to it. The weeks of suspicion, the nights of lying awake, wondering if I was losing my mind. By the time I finally had the evidence I needed, I was a mess of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, and a strange, cold determination. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make sure she understood the full weight of what she'd done. It started with the pregnancy test. She came to me one morning, tears streaming down her face, holding the little stick with its unmistakable result. "Honey, I have great news, I'm pregnant," she said, her voice trembling with joy. For a moment, I just stared at her, my mind racing. This was supposed to be a happy moment, a moment we'd dreamed about for years. but all I felt was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I didn't say anything at first. I just took the test from her hand and looked at it, my mind spinning. She was crying, but they weren't tears of joy anymore. They were tears of relief, of triumph. She thought this was going to fix everything, that this baby was going to bring us back together. But she was wrong. Dead wrong. I handed the test back to her and walked over to the closet where I'd hidden the suitcase. I pulled it out and set it on the bed, then turned to face her. "Great," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I called your boss's wife and told her that her husband is going to be a daddy. The delivery truck is already waiting for you. You're moving out." The look on her face was something I'll never forget. Her tears stopped midstream, her mouth hanging open in shock. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer her. Instead, I reached into the suitcase and pulled out the divorce papers, along with the videotape I'd made of her and Johnson. I handed them to her, watching as her hands shook, as her eyes darted from the papers to the tape and back again. What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's over, Sarah," I said, my voice cold and final. "I know everything. I've known for weeks. And now it's time for you to leave." She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and fear. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then the tears started again, but this time they were different, desperate, pleading. "Please," she begged, reaching for me. "Please, let me explain. It's not what you think." I stepped back, out of her reach. "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by lying to me again. I've seen the texts, I've seen the video. I know everything, Sarah. And there's nothing you can say that will change that." She crumpled to the floor, sobbing, clutching the divorce papers to her chest. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. It just happened." I didn't respond. I just stood there, watching her fall apart, feeling nothing but cold, hard anger. This woman, the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted with my life, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And now she was sitting on the floor, crying like she was the victim. "Get up," I said, my voice sharp. "You need to leave. Now." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, her face streaked with tears. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice breaking. "That's not my problem," I said. "You should have thought about that before you started sleeping with your boss." She flinched at my words, like I'd slapped her. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at me, like she was waiting for me to change my mind, to take it all back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Finally, she stood up, her legs shaking, and started packing her things. She moved slowly, like she was in a daze, throwing clothes and toiletries into the suitcase without really looking at them. I stood there, watching her, my arms crossed, my heart like a stone in my chest. When she was done, she zipped up the suitcase and turned to me, her eyes pleading. "Please," she said again, "don't do this. We can fix this. We can work through it." I shook my head. "No, Sarah, we can't. Some things can't be fixed." She stared at me for a long moment, like she was trying to memorize my face. Then she picked up the suitcase and walked to the door. She paused there, her hand on the knob, and looked back at me one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching as she opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and just like that, she was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, feeling nothing. No relief, no sadness, no anger, just emptiness. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was gone. And she'd taken everything with her, not just her things, but the life we'd built together, the future we'd dreamed of. I walked over to the window and watched as she got into the delivery truck, as it pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. And then I turned away, back to the empty house, back to the life I now had to rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. But for the first time, in a long time, I felt free. Free from the lies, free from the betrayal, free from the pain. And that, in its own way, was a kind of victory. The days after Sarah left were a blur. The house felt too big, too quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I wandered from room to room, not really knowing what to do with myself. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her photos on the walls, her favorite mug in the cupboard, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. It was like she was still there, haunting me, even though she was gone. I tried to keep busy, to distract myself from the emptiness. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing every surface until my hands were raw. I threw out anything that reminded me of her old clothes, half-empty bottles of lotion, the books she'd left on the nightstand. But no matter how much I cleaned, no matter how much I threw away, I couldn't erase her presence. She was everywhere, in everything, and it was driving me crazy. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't shut off. I'd replay the last few months in my head, over and over, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. Had I missed something? Had there been signs I'd ignored? Or had she just been that good at hiding it? I thought about the deployment, about the letters I'd written her, the promises I'd made. I'd told her I'd come back to her, that we'd build a life together, that we'd be happy. And she'd promised me the same. But now, those promises felt like a cruel joke, like something out of a bad movie. I thought about Johnson too, about the way he'd looked in the video, the way he'd touched her, the way she'd smiled at him. It made my blood boil, just thinking about it. How could she do that? How could she betray me like that? With someone she worked with, someone she saw every day. It was like she'd thrown everything we had in my face, like she'd taken a match to our life and set it on fire. But as much as I hated her, as much as I wanted to scream and shout and break things, I couldn't. I was too tired, too empty. The anger was there, simmering under the surface, but it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. All I felt was a deep, aching sadness, a sense of loss that I couldn't shake. I tried to talk to people about it, to reach out to friends and family, but it was hard. How do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone that the person you loved, the person you trusted more than anyone in the world, had betrayed you in the worst possible way? Most people didn't know what to say. They'd offer platitudes. You'll get through this. Time heals all wounds, but it didn't help. It just made me feel more alone. The only person who really understood was my best friend Mike. He'd been through a divorce himself a few years back, and he knew what it was like to have your world turned upside down. He didn't try to sugarcoat it or tell me everything would be okay. He just listened, let me vent, and then told me the truth. It was going to suck for a while. But eventually, it would get better. You'll never forget what happened, he said one night, as we sat on my porch, drinking beer and staring at the stars. But you'll learn to live with it, and one day, you'll wake up and realize you're okay. Not great, maybe, but okay. And that's enough. I didn't believe him at first. How could I? The pain was too fresh, too raw. But as the weeks went by, I started to see what he meant. The anger didn't go away, but it became easier to manage. The sadness didn't disappear, but it became less overwhelming. And slowly, bit by bit, I started to rebuild my life. I threw myself into work, taking on extra shifts and projects to keep my mind occupied. I started going to the gym again, channeling my anger into something productive. I even started seeing a therapist, someone who could help me sort through the mess of emotions I was feeling. It wasn't easy. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the pain felt like too much to bear. But I kept going, kept pushing forward, because I didn't know what else to do. And then, one day something shifted. I woke up and realized that the house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. The memories of Sarah didn't sting quite so much. And for the first time in a long time, I felt okay. Not great, maybe, but okay. I knew I still had a long way to go. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and there would be bumps along the way. But I also knew that I'd survived the worst of it. I'd made it through the deployment, the betrayal, the heartbreak. And if I could survive that, I could survive anything. As I stood there looking out at the world, I realized something important. Sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. It's not about giving up or admitting defeat. It's about choosing yourself, about refusing to stay in a situation that's toxic or unhealthy. And that, in its own way, is a kind of victory. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the lies, free from the pain, free to start over. And that, in its own way, was a kind of victory.